Time moved gently in their home after that. The house that once stood silent now had its own rhythm. Soft laughter in the mornings, quiet talks in the evenings, and the sweet sound of piano keys echoing through the halls. Every corner of that mansion seemed to breathe again, warmed by love instead of wealth. The man's days were no longer about business meetings and deadlines. He still worked, of course, but not with the same obsession. Now he took breaks to have lunch with her, to listen to her stories about school, and sometimes just to sit quietly beside her as she played. She had grown taller now, her hair longer, her smile even brighter. Her music had changed too. It carried confidence, maturity, and something that could only come from someone who had lived through both loneliness and love. One afternoon, as she played a new tune she had composed, he listened from the couch. The melody was calm but powerful, filled with emotion. When she finished, she turned to him with hopeful eyes. "Do you think it's good enough?" she asked shyly. He smiled warmly. "It's more than good. It's beautiful." She grinned, but then her expression turned thoughtful. "I want to play it for other people someday. Not just for you." "You should," he said proudly. "Your music deserves to be heard." "I've been thinking," she continued, "maybe I can help children like the ones at the orphanage. I could play at events and people could donate money to help them. What do you think?" His heart swelled with pride. "I think that's the best idea I've ever heard," he said softly. She smiled brightly. "Then I'll start working on it." From that day forward, she practiced with more passion than ever before. Her dream was simple, not fame or fortune, but kindness. She wanted to give back to the place that had once been her only home. Weeks later, the school organized a charity concert to raise funds for underprivileged children. She was invited to perform as one of the featured musicians. When she told him, his eyes lit up with pride. "I'll be there in the front row," he promised. The evening of the concert came quickly. The auditorium was packed with parents, students, and guests from all over the city. He sat near the front, his heart pounding with excitement. When the lights dimmed and she walked on stage, he felt a surge of emotion. She wore a simple white dress and carried herself with quiet grace. As she sat at the piano, the audience fell silent. The first few notes were soft, but soon the melody grew stronger, wrapping around everyone in the hall. It wasn't just a song, it was a story. It spoke of pain, courage, loss, and love. It carried pieces of her life. Those nights in the orphanage when she played on a broken piano. The day he had first listened to her. The moment she found a real home. Every note reached straight to the heart. Some people closed their eyes. Others wiped away tears. He sat still, his eyes glistening, watching her pour her soul into the music. He had seen many performances in his life, but none had ever felt like this. This wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. When the final note faded, there was silence for a second, then thunderous applause. The crowd stood, cheering, clapping, calling her name. She smiled shyly, bowing her head, and her eyes searched the audience until they found his. He was standing, clapping with tears in his eyes. After the concert, people came to congratulate her. Some offered to sponsor her future performances. Others asked about her story. She answered humbly, saying only, "I just play from my heart." When they got home that night, she placed the small bouquet of flowers she'd received on the piano. Then she turned to him and said softly, "They said my song touched them. Do you think I really made a difference?" He smiled tenderly. "You did, and you will keep making one. That's who you are." She walked up to him and hugged him tightly. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "If you hadn't come to the orphanage that day," he stopped her gently. "If you hadn't played that day," he said, smiling, "my life would still be empty." She smiled through tears. "Then maybe we both saved each other." He nodded quietly. "Yes, I think we did." Over the next few years, her music began to spread. She was invited to play at local events, then on television, and eventually at big charity concerts. She never sought fame, but her sincerity made people love her. Wherever she played, the audience felt something pure and honest. She continued her studies and her music, but she always stayed grounded. Every few months, she visited the orphanage, bringing food, gifts, and sometimes even a small piano for the children to learn. One day, she asked him to come along. When they arrived, the children ran to her, hugging her tightly. The caretaker, older now but still gentle, smiled warmly at them. "It's wonderful to see you both again," she said. "You kept your promise." The girl looked around the room, remembering her past. Then she noticed the old piano in the corner. the same one she used to play. It was worn, some keys chipped, but it still worked. She sat down and ran her fingers across the keys. "It's still here," she whispered. The caretaker chuckled. "It's waiting for you." She began to play softly, and soon the children gathered around, listening in awe. He stood behind her, watching quietly. Her music filled that small room once again, just as it had the first time he ever heard her. After she finished, the caretaker walked over and said quietly, "You've done something special for all of them. They look up to you," the girl smiled. "They just need to believe in themselves. That's all." Later that evening, on their way back home, she sat in the car looking out the window. The city lights passed by like a river of stars. "Do you ever think about how one small thing can change everything?" she asked softly. He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't come to the orphanage that day," she said, "if you hadn't said those words about the piano, I would still be there. You probably didn't mean it at first, but it changed both our lives." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes life has strange ways of leading us where we belong." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Maybe it was meant to happen. The next morning, she surprised him by saying she had been invited to play at an international concert. It would be her first time performing outside the country. He was thrilled but also nervous. "You'll do great," he said proudly. "I'll be cheering from here." "I wish you could come," she said softly. He smiled. "You know I'll always be there with you no matter where you go." When the day of the concert came, she called him right before stepping on stage. "I'm about to play," she said. "Wish me luck," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You don't need luck. You just need your heart. Play like you always do." She smiled through the phone. "I will." When he watched her later that night on the live broadcast, he couldn't help but feel tears in his eyes again. She sat on a grand stage in front of hundreds of people, yet she played with the same sincerity as she did in that small orphanage. Every note carried warmth, faith, and love. The audience gave her a standing ovation, and in that moment, he knew she had fulfilled her dream. A few months later, she returned home, carrying a small award from the concert. She placed it on the piano next to the old drawing she had once given him years ago. "You kept this?" she asked, noticing the drawing still framed on the wall. "Of course," he said softly. "It's where everything began." She looked at it for a long time. The drawing showed two figures sitting by a piano, one tall, one small, smiling together. "It still makes me happy," she said. "It always will," he replied. Years later, as she grew into a young woman, she continued to play, teach, and inspire others. The mansion remained filled with music, laughter, and peace. And the man, once known only for his wealth, became known for something far greater: the kindness that changed both their lives. On quiet evenings, they still sat by the piano, sometimes playing together, sometimes just listening to the sound of life moving gently through the house. And whenever people asked her how her story began, she would smile and say, "It started with a promise. Someone once said they'd adopt me if I played the piano well. But what really happened was something even better. I played and he listened with his heart." The truth was simple. She had played not for money, not for approval, but with pure heart. And in doing so, she had found not only a home, but a family. And the man who once taunted with careless words had discovered something no fortune could ever buy: the beauty of love that began with music. Days after she moved in, everything in the house began to change. The once quiet mansion, where even footsteps used to echo, now had life inside it. The little girl's laughter could be heard from the hallways every morning, and the soft sound of piano keys filled the air every evening. The man often found himself standing by the doorway watching her play. She didn't just press the keys, she seemed to speak through them. Every note she played carried emotion, joy, wonder, curiosity, and sometimes a touch of sadness that reminded him how strong she had been through all her years of loneliness. He began waking up earlier than usual just to share breakfast with her. It was something he never cared about before. He used to eat alone, usually distracted by work calls, but now he'd sit across from her, watching as she tried to pour milk without spilling or as she told him stories about the other children from the orphanage. "Do you miss them?" he asked once. She nodded a little, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, but I'll visit them." "I promised." He smiled gently. "You're a good girl," she grinned back. "You're a good person, too." That simple sentence touched him deeply. He had been called rich, powerful, and even intimidating, but no one had called him a good person in years. Maybe because he had stopped being one for a long time, until she came along and reminded him what kindness really was. In the evenings, they'd sit together in the living room. Sometimes she'd play the piano while he read. Other times, she'd ask him questions about everything she saw. "Why do people work so hard if money can't make them happy?" she once asked. He looked at her, a bit surprised. "That's a big question for a small girl." She tilted her head. "But you work all the time. And you didn't look happy before?" He laughed softly. "You're right," he said honestly. "Money can buy comfort, but not peace. I guess I learned that too late." She thought about it for a moment, then said, "Maybe not too late." "You're smiling now." He didn't know what to say. He realized she was right again. Her presence had softened something in him he thought was gone forever. One day he took her to the park. It was her first time outside since she came to live with him. She ran ahead, chasing butterflies, her laughter ringing through the open air. He followed slowly, his hands in his pockets, watching her with quiet joy. People looked at them and smiled, an old man and a young girl who looked like family. When she got tired, she came running back and held his hand. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said, out of breath. "You're welcome," he replied warmly. "You should get to see the world." "Will you always take me places?" she asked shyly. He smiled. "As long as I can." She leaned against him, and for a brief moment he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. As days turned into weeks, she started attending school. At first she was nervous. She had never been in a private school before, surrounded by children from rich families. The first few days she came home quiet. He noticed it right away. "Is something wrong?" he asked one evening. She hesitated, playing with her spoon. "Some of the kids laugh at me," she said softly. "They say I'm not really like them." His chest tightened. "What do they mean?" "They said, I didn't come from a rich family, so I don't belong there." Her voice cracked slightly. "I tried to ignore them, but it hurts." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached across the table and took her hand. "Listen," he said gently. "You don't need to be born rich to have worth. You're better than what they say. You're kind, brave, and talented. That matters more than anything." Her eyes filled with tears. "But why do they hate me?" "They don't hate you," he said softly. "They just don't understand. Sometimes people fear what's different, but one day they'll see who you really are." She nodded quietly, though her heart was still heavy. That night, when he passed by her room, he heard her playing the piano again. The melody was slow and emotional. It spoke of pain, but also courage. He sat outside her door, listening in silence, realizing that her way of healing was through her music. The next week, the school announced a talent show. When she told him about it, he encouraged her immediately. "You should play," he said. "Let them hear what's inside your heart." She hesitated. "What if they laugh again?" He smiled. "Then let them laugh. But play anyway. Because sometimes the best way to answer people is not with words, but with music." She thought about it for days, then finally agreed. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it." The night of the talent show arrived. The auditorium was full of parents and students. He sat in the front row, dressed neatly but feeling more nervous than he had been in years. When her turn came, she walked onto the stage in a simple white dress. Some children whispered and giggled, but she didn't look at them. She took a deep breath, sat at the piano, and placed her small fingers on the keys. The first note was soft, trembling, but then the melody grew stronger. She played the same piece she once played for him at the orphanage, the one full of hope and warmth. As she played, the audience fell silent. There was no laughter, no whispers, only the sound of pure, heartfelt music filling the room. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then slowly the hall erupted into applause. People stood up, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. He stood too, his heart full of pride. She looked at him from the stage, and their eyes met. She smiled, a smile that said everything without words. After the show, many people came up to her, praising her talent. Even the students who had mocked her earlier now looked at her differently. "You were amazing," one of them said shyly. That night, when they returned home, she couldn't stop smiling. "Did you see them clap?" she asked excitedly. He nodded. "I saw. You were wonderful." She looked at him with glowing eyes. "I was so scared before. But when I saw you sitting there, I felt brave again." He smiled softly. That's because you played from your heart. That's something special no one can take away from you. From that day, things at school changed. The children who once ignored her began sitting with her during lunch. Teachers encouraged her to join music competitions. She began to believe in herself again. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, she turned to him and asked, "Do you think my real parents would be proud of me?" He looked at her gently. "I'm sure they would," he said. "But you know what? I'm proud of you too," she smiled softly. "You're my real parent now." Those words hit him deeply. He had spent his whole life earning respect and power, but nothing compared to that moment. Hearing her call him that was the greatest gift he could ever receive. He got up and walked to the piano, standing beside her. "Play something," he said with a smile. She giggled. "Only if you play with me." He laughed, sitting beside her awkwardly. "I haven't touched a piano in years." "Then it's time to learn again," she said brightly. They started to play together, clumsy at first, then slowly in rhythm. The notes weren't perfect, but the laughter between them made it sound like the happiest melody in the world. As the sun set outside, the golden light spilled through the windows, touching the piano keys. For once, his mansion was not just a house of wealth, it was filled with warmth, music, and love. He looked at her and thought about how much she had changed his life. She didn't just bring sound into his home, she brought purpose, hope, and peace. And as she kept playing beside him, he realized something else. The girl who had once played the piano in a small orphanage to survive was now playing it in his home. Not because she had to, but because she finally had a reason to smile, he whispered quietly. "You've made this place come alive again." She looked up at him and said with a soft laugh, "No, you did when you kept your promise." He smiled, eyes glistening. "Then maybe we both did." The music continued, gentle and pure, filling every corner of the house with something no amount of money could ever buy. Love that came straight from the heart. Days passed slowly after that night, but the thought never left his mind. He couldn't focus on business meetings anymore. Even when he sat in his office, surrounded by tall glass walls and busy assistants, his thoughts kept drifting back to the small orphanage. He could see her face in his mind, those calm eyes that hid strength, that smile that somehow made his heart feel lighter. He realized that what he felt for her wasn't just sympathy. It was something deeper, like a quiet bond that had formed without him noticing. Every time he saw her, something inside him softened. He had spent his life being surrounded by people who wanted his money or his name, but this little girl didn't want either. All she wanted was someone to listen. One evening, he went back to the orphanage again. The caretaker greeted him with a smile. "She's feeling better now," she said. "She even asked if you would come." He couldn't help but smile. "Is that so?" "Yes," the caretaker nodded. "You've become very special to her. She says she plays better when you're here." He felt something warm move through him. "May I see her?" he asked. "Of course," the caretaker said kindly. "She's in the music room." When he entered the small room, the familiar sound of the piano met his ears. She was sitting there playing softly, her little hands dancing across the keys. The moment she saw him, her face lit up. "Sir, you came," he smiled. "You sound better already." "I wanted to finish the song I told you about," she said proudly, "the one I was learning before I got sick." "Then I'm ready to hear it," he said, sitting down nearby. She started to play. The melody began quietly, almost like a whisper, but then it grew fuller, warmer, brighter. It was a tune full of hope, the kind of music that made you believe the world could be beautiful again. She didn't play for attention or applause. She played because that's where her heart lived. When the last note faded, she turned to him, her eyes shining. "Did you like it?" He nodded slowly. "More than you can imagine," he said. "That was beautiful." Her smile widened. "I played it for you, because you always listen." Those simple words made his heart ache in a way he didn't expect. No one had ever said something like that to him. In his world, people listened out of fear or for profit, but this child said it with sincerity. He stayed for a while, watching as she helped the younger children take turns pressing the piano keys. He could see how gentle she was with them, how she encouraged them even when they played the wrong notes. Every gesture of hers carried kindness. When it was time for him to leave, she ran to the door and waved. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "Yes, I will." That night, when he returned to his grand home, he didn't turn on the lights immediately. He stood near the window staring at the empty piano in his living room. For the first time, it looked lifeless to him. Everything in that mansion was spotless, perfect, but silent. He sat down on the couch and thought about the laughter he had heard at the orphanage, the way the children hugged each other before bedtime, and how the girl had smiled while teaching them. There was more love in that small building than in all his years of wealth. He picked up the drawing she had given him earlier, the one of her and him beside the piano. The crayon lines were simple, yet the emotion behind them was pure. Something in that picture spoke to him louder than all the compliments he had ever received in his successful career. He finally whispered to himself, "I can't let her stay there forever. She deserves more than that." The next morning, he visited the orphanage again, but this time, his purpose was clear. The caretaker noticed the serious look on his face. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I want to talk about her," he said. The caretaker invited him into her office, a small cozy room with old books and children's drawings on the wall. He sat down, his hands clasped together, unsure of how to begin. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "She's talented, kind, and full of potential. But more than that, she deserves a proper home, a family." The caretaker looked at him carefully. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He took a deep breath. "I want to adopt her." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the caretaker smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "I can't say I'm surprised," she said. "I've seen the way you look at her. You care deeply." He nodded, his voice quiet. "She's changed something in me. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't imagine not having her in my life." The caretaker leaned forward. "You'll need to go through the proper legal steps. It may take time, but I believe it's the right thing for both of you." He exhaled with relief. "Then let's begin." That day marked the start of a new chapter. He filled out papers, met with officials, and began preparing his home. One room in his mansion, which had always been empty, was transformed into something special, a bright space with a piano in the corner, colorful curtains, and shelves full of storybooks. For the first time, that house didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like it was waiting for someone. A few weeks later, the caretaker called him. "She doesn't know yet," she said. "Would you like to tell her yourself?" He didn't even hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I'll come right away." When he arrived, she was sitting near the piano again, humming softly. He walked up to her with a smile. "I have some news for you," he said gently. She looked up curiously. "Good news?" He nodded. "Do you remember the day I first came here and said something foolish about adopting someone who could play the piano well?" She giggled a little. "Yes, you said that as a joke." He smiled softly. It wasn't a joke anymore. She blinked, not understanding at first. "What do you mean?" He knelt down to her level. "I mean," he said slowly, "if you would let me, I would like to give you a home." For a moment, she just stared at him, her small lips parted in shock. You want to adopt me?" she whispered. He nodded. "Only if you want that too." Her eyes filled with tears instantly. "You mean I'd live with you? In your big house?" "Yes," he said softly. "You'll have your own room, your own piano, and everything you need. But most importantly, you'll have someone who cares for you." She couldn't speak. Tears ran down her cheeks as she threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered over and over. "Thank you." He held her carefully, his throat tightening. For years, he had built walls around himself, thinking emotions made him weak. But in that moment, Holding a child who had nothing yet gave him everything. He realized that love didn't make him weak. It made him human again. The caretaker stood at the door, smiling through her tears. "Looks like she's already said yes," she said softly. He looked up and smiled too. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling slightly. She did. Over the next few days, everything moved quickly. Papers were signed, arrangements were made, and soon the day came when she packed her small bag. The children at the orphanage hugged her tightly, some crying, but she promised she would visit often. When she stepped into his car, she looked back one last time at the old building that had been her home for so long. Then she looked at him and smiled. "It feels strange," she said quietly. "Like a dream." He looked down at her and said, "Dreams do come true sometimes, especially when your heart is pure." She nodded and leaned her head against the car window as they drove away. When they reached his mansion, she gasped. The place looked enormous compared to the orphanage, but he had made sure it felt warm. Her room was waiting, filled with sunlight, books, and a new piano near the window. She ran to it immediately, her fingers tracing the keys. "It's so beautiful," she said, laughing. He stood behind her and smiled. "It's yours now. Play whenever you want." She turned and looked up at him with shining eyes. "You really kept your promise," she whispered. He nodded. "I did. And I'll keep it for the rest of my life." As her fingers touched the keys and the first soft melody filled the air, he sat back and listened, realizing that this moment was worth more than all the wealth he had ever earned. And as her music filled the once empty mansion, it finally became what it was always missing, a home. The following week, the millionaire found himself thinking about the orphanage more than he thought he would. Every morning at breakfast, while reading the newspaper or signing documents, his mind wandered back to the sound of that piano. It wasn't just the music he missed, it was the feeling that came with it. That calm, peaceful moment when the world seemed to stop, when his heart had felt strangely alive again. He had lived most of his life surrounded by people who spoke in numbers, deals, and profits. No one ever talked about feelings or dreams. But now the memory of that little girl playing from her heart kept echoing inside him. Her song had somehow broken through the wall he had built over the years. One afternoon he canceled all his meetings and told his driver to take him to the orphanage. The caretaker welcomed him warmly, a bit surprised to see him again. "You've become our most frequent visitor," she said kindly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I enjoy good music," he said. She chuckled. "She's in the garden helping the younger ones with their homework." When he walked outside, he saw her sitting under a big tree, surrounded by small children. Her hair was tied up messily, and she was holding a worn-out notebook, explaining something to one of the little boys. There was patience in her voice, and the way she smiled at them made the entire scene look peaceful. He stood quietly for a moment, watching. It amazed him that a child who had lost everything could still give so much warmth to others. When she noticed him standing there, she jumped up quickly. "Oh, hello, sir," she said politely. He smiled slightly. "You seem busy." "I'm helping them learn to write letters," she said proudly. "They want to send notes to the families who sometimes visit." He nodded. "That's very kind of you," she shrugged. "We help each other here. It makes the days happier." He looked around the yard at the small swings, the laughter of the children, and the simple joy they shared. It made him think of his own childhood, how different it was. He grew up in a house full of strict rules and cold words. No one smiled much. His father was a businessman too, always teaching him that emotions were distractions and that money was the only thing that gave power. He had followed that rule his entire life, and now, standing in that orphanage yard, he realized how wrong it had been. The caretaker joined them a moment later and said gently, "She's been practicing every day since you brought the piano. The other children love to listen." The girl looked shy. "It helps me sleep better when I play," she admitted. He smiled. "Would you play something for me today?" Her eyes brightened immediately. "Yes, sir. I've been learning something new." They walked back inside where the piano stood near the window. She sat down, straightened her back, and began to play. This time her notes sounded stronger, more confident, as if her heart was healing with every song. The melody filled the room with warmth, and for a few moments, It felt as if the world outside didn't exist when she finished. He found himself clapping again, something he rarely did for anyone. "You've improved," he said honestly. She grinned shyly. "I just keep remembering how my father played. I don't want to forget his music." He nodded slowly. "You won't," he said quietly. "Not as long as you keep playing." After that day, his visits became more frequent. Sometimes he brought books for the children or fruits from his garden. Other times he just came to listen. The girl always seemed happy to see him, and he started to enjoy their small conversations. She would talk about the songs she wanted to learn or the things she dreamed of doing one day. Once she told him, "I want to teach children how to play the piano too, like my father taught me." He smiled. "That's a beautiful dream." She looked up at him curiously. "Did you ever have a dream, sir?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then he replied softly, "A long time ago, maybe. But I forgot it somewhere along the way." She frowned a little. "You should find it again. My father used to say, 'If you lose your dream, you lose your song.'" He looked at her and smiled faintly. "Your father was a wise man." As he drove home that day, her words stayed with him. "If you lose your dream, you lose your song." It sounded simple, but it hit him deeply. He realized he had indeed lost his song a long time ago, the part of him that could feel joy, care, and meaning. Over the next few weeks, the millionaire made more changes in his life than he had in years. He started to spend less time at grand parties and more time visiting small places like the orphanage. He even asked his staff to arrange a music tutor for the children, without telling them it was his idea. He wanted them to have more than just food and shelter. He wanted them to have a reason to smile. The caretaker began to notice his quiet generosity. One evening, she said to him, "You've done so much for these children, especially for her. She talks about you often, you know." He looked surprised. "Does she?" "Yes," the caretaker said warmly. "She says you're different, that you listen when she plays, not just with your ears, but with your heart." He didn't know how to respond to that. He had never been described that way before, but hearing it made something inside him soften. One afternoon, while the girl was practicing, he walked over and placed a small box on the piano. She stopped and looked at it curiously. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it," he said. Inside, there was a delicate silver locket with a tiny piano charm on it. Her eyes widened as she picked it up carefully. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled. "When you wear it, remember what your father taught you, play from your heart." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "Thank you, sir. I'll never take it off." That evening, as he left the orphanage, something unexpected happened. One of the younger children ran after his car and handed him a folded piece of paper. "She made this for you," the boy said shyly before running back. He opened it inside the car. It was a drawing, simple, made with colored pencils. It showed the girl sitting at a piano, and beside her stood a tall man smiling. Underneath, she had written in uneven letters, "Thank you for listening to my music." He sat there for a long time, staring at the drawing. He felt his chest tighten, his eyes blur. No one had ever thanked him like that before. Not for his money, not for his donations, but for simply being there. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the drawing. He placed it on his desk next to a picture of his late parents. It looked out of place among his expensive things, but somehow, it felt like the only thing that truly mattered there. As days turned into weeks, his bond with the girl grew stronger. He started to look forward to her laughter, her stories, her songs. Whenever she smiled at him, it felt like sunlight entering a dark room. But one day, when he arrived at the orphanage, he found the atmosphere different. The caretaker looked worried. "She's not feeling well today," she said. "She caught a fever last night." His heart sank. "Can I see her?" The caretaker nodded and led him to a small room. The girl was lying on her bed, her face pale but her eyes still bright. When she saw him, she tried to sit up. "I'm okay, sir," she said weakly. "I just need rest." He sat beside her, his voice soft. "You should have told me sooner. You need proper care," she smiled faintly. "I'll be fine. I was dreaming about playing for you again. I was learning a new song before I got sick." He looked at her and gently placed his hand over hers. "You'll play it soon," he said. "But for now, just rest. Music can wait." She nodded, her eyelids heavy. Before she fell asleep, she whispered, "You remind me of my father sometimes. He used to sit beside me like this." His throat tightened and he looked away. That night, he couldn't sleep again. Her words stayed with him like an echo. In that quiet moment, he understood something he had never realized before. It wasn't just her life that was changing, it was his. And deep inside, he already knew what he wanted to do next. He didn't say it out loud yet, but his heart had made a decision. He wanted to give that girl more than lessons or gifts. He wanted to give her a home. The next morning, the millionaire woke earlier than usual. He wasn't sure why, but sleep hadn't given him peace. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that small girl sitting at the piano, her fingers moving with such honesty that it hurt to think about. He tried to push the thought away, but her face kept returning, calm, innocent, yet full of silent strength. He had spent years building his empire, chasing numbers, closing deals, and collecting things that could impress the world. But that girl, with nothing in her name, had played a few notes and shaken something deep inside him. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it wasn't the music. It was what he saw behind it. He walked to his study where the piano stood untouched in one corner. He sat down and stared at the keys. For a long moment he didn't play. His hands rested on the cold surface, and he remembered how her small fingers had moved with emotion. When he finally pressed a key, it sounded hollow. He tried again, and the emptiness of his own music filled the room. No feeling, no story, just noise. He closed the lid and sighed heavily. His heart felt heavy too. For years he had believed emotions made people weak. He had told himself that caring too much would only lead to disappointment. That belief had made him rich, but also alone. Later that day, as he sat through meetings, his mind kept wandering back to the orphanage. The faces of those children came to him, their quiet smiles, their shy curiosity. And then that one girl sitting so still yet speaking through her piano without saying a word. That evening he made a decision without understanding why. He told his driver to take him back to the orphanage. The driver looked surprised but didn't ask questions. When they reached the building, the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. The place looked peaceful just as it had the day before. The caretaker met him at the door, surprised to see him again. "Oh, sir, we didn't expect you today," she said politely. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to check something," he said, unsure how to explain. "Is the girl here the one who played yesterday?" The caretaker nodded. "Yes, she's helping in the kitchen. Would you like me to call her?" He hesitated, then nodded. A few moments later, the girl appeared, her small hands still wet from washing dishes. She looked up at him with the same quiet eyes. "Hello, sir," she said softly. He looked at her, suddenly feeling awkward. "Hello," he replied. "You played very well yesterday." "Thank you," she said, a faint smile forming. He looked around the room, trying to find the right words. "Do you play often?" he asked. "Only when no one is busy," she said. "Sometimes the other children sing. It makes the place happy." Something about the way she said it struck him. Music wasn't just sound to her, it was warmth. It was family. He sat down on a nearby chair. "Would you play again?" he asked quietly. She nodded, wiped her hands on her dress, and went to the piano. She didn't need to be told twice. When she began playing, the same feeling filled the room. This time, he didn't look at her hands, he looked at her face. The calmness there, the peace she carried even after all she'd lost, made him feel something unfamiliar. Respect. When she finished, he found himself clapping softly. She looked surprised, almost shy, but smiled again. He said gently, "You play differently from anyone I've heard. You don't just play, you feel every note." She tilted her head and said, "That's how my father used to say it. He told me that music is like talking without words. You don't play to show off, you play to say what's inside your heart." Those words echoed in his mind. He didn't answer right away. He just nodded slowly. "He was right," he said quietly. The caretaker, who had been standing nearby, smiled warmly. "Her father used to work as a pianist in a small restaurant," she explained. "He loved his daughter more than anything. After the accident, she never stopped playing. It's how she remembers him." The millionaire looked at the piano, then back at the girl.
"How old are you?"
10, she said. He didn't know what made him ask the next question. "Do you ever wish to have a piano of your own?" Her eyes brightened for the first time. "I dream of it sometimes," she whispered. "But dreams are free, right?" Her answer broke something inside him. For a moment he didn't trust his voice. He stood up, pretending to straighten his jacket. "Dreams are not always free," he said quietly. "Sometimes they cost everything." The caretaker looked at him curiously, but he only nodded and said he would be in touch. Before leaving, he turned to the girl once more and said, "Keep playing. Don't ever stop." When he reached home that night, he didn't go to his office or his study. Instead, he sat in his living room, staring at nothing. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual. He realized he hadn't spoken to anyone at home for months. No family, no laughter, no warmth. Just walls and echoes. He remembered how the children at the orphanage laughed together, how they shared food, how they took turns helping each other. They had nothing, yet somehow they had more life in them than he ever did. He poured himself a glass of water and walked to the window. The city lights sparkled outside, cold and distant. And then he heard it again in his mind, the melody she played. It was simple, yet it carried more meaning than any symphony he had ever heard. The next day, he asked his assistant to buy a small piano and have it delivered to the orphanage. He didn't want anyone to know who sent it. When the caretaker called to thank him, he simply said, "It's for the children. Let them play." But deep inside, he knew who it was really for. Days passed, but he couldn't stay away. Every few days, he found himself returning to the orphanage under the excuse of checking donations. The truth was, he wanted to see her again. Each time she seemed a little more confident, a little happier. She would play whenever he asked, and every time, her music felt new, sometimes joyful, sometimes sad, but always alive. One afternoon, while she played, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. The other children gathered around her, clapping, laughing, singing softly along. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was giving happiness to everyone around her. He realized then that what he had been searching for all his life, peace, connection, meaning, was right there in that room. And it wasn't money or power that gave it to him. It was a child who played a piano with a heart full of love. When the song ended, he sat quietly for a long moment. The caretaker smiled and said gently, "She brings life to this place, doesn't she?" He nodded. "Yes," he said softly, "more than she knows." The caretaker hesitated, then said, "You know, sir, she never talks much about her parents. But sometimes when she plays, she looks toward the window as if she thinks they can hear her." He felt a lump in his throat. "Maybe they can," he whispered. That night, when he returned home, he couldn't stop thinking about her again. He walked through his huge house and realized how empty it felt. He had all the space in the world, but not a single corner that felt alive. The thought of that small girl living in a crowded orphanage with nothing but her piano made him feel ashamed. He sat at his own piano again, opened the lid, and placed his hands on the keys. For the first time, he tried to play what he felt, not what he knew. The notes were uneven, clumsy, but real. He stopped midway and laughed softly to himself. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man made of steel. He felt human. He thought about her words again. "Dreams are free, right?" He whispered to himself. Maybe it's time someone gave her one that isn't just a dream. He didn't know yet how to do it, but one thing was clear. That little girl had changed something in him forever, and without realizing it, he had started to care. Not out of guilt or pity, but because her pure heart had reminded him what being alive truly meant. And deep down, in a quiet corner of his heart, the decision had already begun to form. He was going to make her dream come true. It was a bright morning in the city when the black car stopped in front of the old orphanage. The children gathered near the windows, pressing their faces against the glass, curious about who had arrived. The sound of expensive shoes echoed on the stone floor as a tall man stepped inside. He was known in the city for his money, his business power, and his cold heart. Everyone called him the millionaire. He had everything people could dream of: cars, houses, servants, and endless luxuries, but his eyes were always empty, as if nothing truly touched his heart. That day, he came to the orphanage because his company had donated a piano. The orphanage wanted to thank him, and the head caretaker had invited him to visit the children. He didn't usually accept such invitations, but that morning he was bored and decided to stop by. When he walked inside, the children stood in a line, quiet and nervous. The caretaker smiled warmly and said, "Sir, the children are so excited to meet you. They've been waiting since morning." He nodded slightly, pretending to care. His sharp eyes scanned the room. To him, it was just another dull visit. He noticed the new piano sitting in the corner, shining under the light. It looked expensive and out of place in that old room. With a half smile, he asked, "So, who plays this thing?" The caretaker laughed softly. "Some of them try, sir. None are trained, but they love to play and sing." He raised his eyebrow. "Really? Children from here can play the piano?" His tone carried more mockery than curiosity. The caretaker didn't know how to answer, so she stayed quiet. He smirked and said loudly, "Tell you what, if one of them can play something that doesn't hurt my ears, maybe I'll adopt her." The words came out as a joke, but they cut through the air like a knife. The children froze. Adoption was not a word they took lightly. For them it meant family, safety, love, all the things they prayed for every night. The millionaire didn't notice the silence his words caused. He thought he was being funny, but the caretaker looked at him with discomfort and said softly, "Sir, please, they are just children." He waved his hand. "Oh, come now, I'm only teasing. Let's see what they can do. Maybe someone will surprise me." The children looked at one another nervously. None wanted to step forward. The piano looked so big and strange, and the man's cold stare made them even more afraid. Then from the back of the room, a small hand rose slowly. A thin girl with untidy hair stepped forward. She looked no older than 10. Her clothes were simple and slightly worn, but her eyes had something rare, calmness mixed with quiet courage. The caretaker looked surprised. "Are you sure, dear?" she whispered. The girl nodded. The millionaire raised an eyebrow, amused. You can play?" The girl looked up at him and said softly, "I can try." Something in her tone made the room go still. There was no arrogance or fear, just honesty. The millionaire folded his arms, pretending to be bored, but there was a faint spark of curiosity in his eyes. "All right, little one," he said. "Let's see what you've got." The girl walked toward the piano. The stool was a bit high, so she had to climb onto it carefully. Her legs dangled above the floor. She looked at the shiny keys for a long moment, as if remembering something. The other children watched quietly from behind, whispering to each other. The millionaire checked his watch, waiting for her to start. At first, her fingers trembled slightly. Then she pressed a few soft keys and a sound filled the room. Gentle, uncertain, but beautiful. The noise of the city outside seemed to fade away. She began to play more confidently, and soon the notes came alive. What came out of the piano wasn't perfect music. It wasn't trained or polished. But it was something deeper. Each note carried feeling, pain, longing, hope. Her little hands moved across the keys with surprising grace, as if the piano itself understood her heart. The caretaker's eyes began to glisten. The children stood frozen, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The millionaire's face changed slowly. The mocking smile disappeared. His eyes followed every movement of her hands. He didn't understand how this small child could play something that reached inside him, something that reminded him of things he thought he had forgotten: loneliness, loss, and the hunger for love. The girl closed her eyes as she played. She didn't care who was watching. In that moment, she wasn't in the orphanage anymore. She was somewhere else, in a world where her parents were still alive, where she had a home, where someone waited for her. The melody seemed to carry her there, and everyone listening followed her silently. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air like a whisper. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly the children began to clap. The caretaker wiped her tears and joined them. The millionaire didn't clap. He just sat there, looking at her with an expression no one could read. The girl stood up from the stool and looked down, embarrassed by the attention. "I'm sorry if it wasn't good," she murmured. The millionaire finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Where did you learn that?" She looked up shyly. "My father used to play. I watched him. I just remember how it sounded." The millionaire's chest tightened, though he didn't know why. "Where is he now?" he asked without thinking. The caretaker quickly stepped in, her tone gentle. "She lost her parents 2 years ago, sir." The room went silent again. The millionaire didn't say anything. He looked at the girl, so small yet full of emotion, and felt something strange stirring inside him. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He finally stood up and cleared his throat. "That was impressive," he said awkwardly. He took out his checkbook and wrote a donation. "Use this for her lessons," he said to the caretaker, though his tone sounded unsure, almost conflicted. The caretaker smiled gratefully, but she could see the change in his eyes. He didn't look like the same man who had walked in mocking the children earlier. As he turned to leave, he glanced one last time at the girl. She was sitting quietly again, her small hands resting on the piano keys as if saying goodbye to an old friend. That image stayed in his mind all day. Even as he returned to his mansion, surrounded by luxury and silence, the sound of her melody followed him. He poured himself a drink and sat in his grand living room, staring at the wall, but all he could hear was her playing. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way she played, as if the notes were talking to him directly. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a moment of weakness. Yet as the night grew deeper, he found himself walking toward his own piano, a grand black instrument that no one had touched in years. He opened the lid and pressed a few keys. The sound echoed, but it was lifeless, cold, empty, just like everything around him. He thought of the little girl's words again. I just remember how it sounded. How could someone with so little have so much feeling in her music? That question wouldn't leave him. He went to bed late that night, unable to sleep. His thoughts kept drifting back to the orphanage, to her calm eyes and her trembling hands. For the first time in years, he wondered what it meant to feel truly alive. The next morning, before his staff even arrived, he found himself standing by the window, looking at the city below. The world looked different somehow, less sharp, more fragile. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he knew he would go back to that orphanage again. Somewhere deep inside, the man who once mocked love and emotion felt something break open, like a door he never realized was locked. And through that door, the sound of a child's piano still played softly, calling him back. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that simple act of a girl playing a song from her heart, was about to change everything in his life forever. It was a bright morning in the city when the black car stopped in front of the old orphanage. The children gathered near the windows, pressing their faces against the glass, curious about who had arrived. The sound of expensive shoes echoed on the stone floor as a tall man stepped inside. He was known in the city for his money, his business power, and his cold heart. Everyone called him the millionaire. He had everything people could dream of: cars, houses, servants, and endless luxuries, but his eyes were always empty, as if nothing truly touched his heart. That day, he came to the orphanage because his company had donated a piano. The orphanage wanted to thank him, and the head caretaker had invited him to visit the children. He didn't usually accept such invitations, but that morning he was bored and decided to stop by. When he walked inside, the children stood in a line, quiet and nervous. The caretaker smiled warmly and said, "Sir, the children are so excited to meet you. They've been waiting since morning." He nodded slightly, pretending to care. His sharp eyes scanned the room. To him, it was just another dull visit. He noticed the new piano sitting in the corner, shining under the light. It looked expensive and out of place in that old room. With a half smile, he asked, "So, who plays this thing?" The caretaker laughed softly. "Some of them try, sir. None are trained, but they love to play and sing." He raised his eyebrow. "Really? Children from here can play the piano?" His tone carried more mockery than curiosity. The caretaker didn't know how to answer, so she stayed quiet. He smirked and said loudly, "Tell you what, if one of them can play something that doesn't hurt my ears, maybe I'll adopt her." The words came out as a joke, but they cut through the air like a knife. The children froze. Adoption was not a word they took lightly. For them it meant family, safety, love, all tea.